They called her just the cleaning lady at Crimson Valley Air Force Base, invisible to the pilots who strutted past her mop bucket in their crisp flight suits. But when enemy missiles locked onto American soil and every trained pilot was grounded, Diana Kellerman would climb into the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor and remind the world that heroes don't always wear wings on their chest. Sometimes they carry cleaning supplies in calloused hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly beyond the razor wire fences of Crimson Valley Air Force Base, where the morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac and the thunderous roar of America's most advanced fighter jets shattered the silence daily. This wasn't just any military installation. It was home to the 77th Tactical Fighter Wing, an elite squadron that flew the F-22 Raptor, the world's most sophisticated air superiority fighter. Here, among the billion-dollar aircraft and the nation's finest pilots, moved a woman who seemed to belong to an entirely different world. Diana Kellerman pushed her industrial, cleaning cart across the polished concrete floors of Hangar 7, her steel-toed boots making soft squeaking sounds that were quickly swallowed by the cavernous space. At 45, she had the weathered hands of someone who had spent decades working with machinery, and eyes that held depths of knowledge that no one at Crimson Valley had ever bothered to explore. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, hidden beneath a regulation cleaning cap that bore the base's insignia, the only military marking she was authorized to wear docked to the pilots, ground crews, and officers who passed her daily. Diana was simply part of the background. She was the woman who mopped their floors, emptied their trash cans, and cleaned their windows. She worked the graveyard shift, arriving when most personnel were heading home to their families, moving through the hangars like a ghost in navy blue coveralls. Her supervisor's reports consistently rated her as reliable and quiet. Hardly the words one would associate with someone who would soon become the most talked about person on the base. But Diana Kellerman harbored secrets that ran deeper than the Mojave Desert aquifers beneath the base. 23 years earlier, she had been Captain Diana Kellerman of the Royal Canadian Air Force, one of only 12 women selected for Canada's experimental fighter pilot program in the early 2000s. She had logged over 1,200 hours in CF-18 Hornets, had completed advanced tactical training at the Top Gun equivalent in Cold Lake, Alberta, and had been deemed exceptional by every flight instructor who had ever worked with her. Her downfall had come not from lack of skill, but from a split-second decision during a training exercise over the Labrador Sea, when her wingman's aircraft suffered catastrophic hydraulic failure during a simulated combat mission. Diana had broken formation and protocol to guide him safely to an emergency landing. The maneuver saved his life but violated direct orders from their commanding officer. The subsequent investigation revealed that while her actions had been heroic, they had also been insubordinate. In the rigid hierarchy of military aviation, there was no tolerance for pilots who, however well-intentioned, chose their own judgment over explicit commands. The court-martial had been swift and merciless. Diana was stripped of her wings, discharged from service, and blacklisted from commercial aviation. The official records were sealed, her achievements erased. Her future in the cockpit ended before her 30th birthday. She had fought the decision through every legal channel available, but the military's verdict was final. The woman who had once danced through the clouds in a multi-million-dollar fighter jet found herself applying for civilian jobs with a resume that, on paper, showed nothing but a mysterious 8-year gap in her employment history. The transition to civilian life had been brutal. Diana had moved to the United States, drawn by the promise of employment opportunities in the aerospace industry, but without an official flying record that she could legally reference, and with no civilian pilot's license to compensate for her military experience. She found herself shut out of every aviation-related job. The skills that had once made her exceptional, her intimate understanding of flight systems, her ability to read weather patterns like a book, her supernatural feel for aircraft performance, became useless in a world that valued certificates. Overcapability. For 2 decades, Diana had worked a series of jobs that kept her close to the world she loved, but could no longer fully inhabit. She had been a mechanic at a small regional airport, a parts inspector for a defense contractor, and a maintenance supervisor at a cargo airline. Each position had taught her new aspects of aviation, the intricate details of aircraft systems, the complexity of modern avionics, the subtle signs that indicated when something was wrong with a machine that most people saw as incomprehensibly complex. 3 years ago, when budget cuts had eliminated her position at the cargo airline, Diana had seen the job posting for a cleaning position at Crimson Valley Air Force Base. The pay was modest, the hours were difficult, and the work was menial. But it offered something that no other job could provide: daily proximity to the aircraft she had once commanded. Every night, as she moved through the hangars with her cleaning supplies, Diana was surrounded by the sights, sounds, and smells of military aviation. She could hear the subtle differences in engine pitch that indicated maintenance issues. She could spot hydraulic leaks, electrical problems, and structural stress points that the ground crews sometimes missed during their hurried inspections. The F-22 Raptors were particularly fascinating to her. These weren't the CF-18s she had flown in Canada. They were a generation beyond anything she had experienced, incorporating stealth technology, thrust vectoring, and avionic systems that represented the cutting edge of aerospace engineering. During her quiet night shifts, Diana had studied these machines with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. She had memorized their specifications, learned their systems, and developed an intuitive understanding of their capabilities that rivaled that of many of the pilots who flew them. But to everyone at Crimson Valley, she remained invisible. Pilots who walked past her as she cleaned their ready rooms never imagined that the woman emptying their trash cans could discuss thrust-to-weight ratios and radar cross-sections with greater precision than most aviation engineers. The ground crews who nodded politely as she mopped around their workstations never suspected that she could diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone. The officers who occasionally thanked her for keeping their facilities clean never dreamed that she had once been considered one of the most promising fighter pilots of her generation. Diana had made peace with her invisibility. She had accepted that her flying days were over, that her expertise would remain forever unrecognized, that she would spend the remainder of her career in the shadows of the world she had once soared above. She took quiet satisfaction in her work, knowing that her efforts contributed, however modestly, to the mission of defending American airspace. She had no way of knowing that within hours, a crisis would emerge that would strip away her anonymity forever, forcing her to choose between maintaining her quiet anonymity and stepping forward to save not just the base, but potentially the entire region from a threat that only someone with her unique combination of skills and experience could pairing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 years earlier, Diana Kellerman had stood at the security checkpoint of Crimson Valley Air Force Base, clutching a manila folder containing her employment paperwork and feeling the familiar weight of entering a military installation after so many years away. The September morning was crisp, with the Nevada sun just beginning to burn off the desert chill, and the distant sound of jet engines warming up on the flight line carried across the base like a siren call from her past. Purpose of visit? The young security airman had asked, barely glancing up from his computer screen. "I'm starting work today," Diana replied quietly, sliding her temporary badge across the counter. "Facilities maintenance, night shift cleaning crew." The airman's eyes flicked over her application, noting her age and civilian status. At 42, Deanna was older than most new hires, and her quiet demeanor and worn clothing marked her as someone who needed the job rather than someone pursuing a career. "Building assignments are in your packet," he said, handing back her credentials. "Report to Supervisor Martinez in Building 12. Welcome to Crimson Valley." As Diana walked through the base gates for the first time as an employee, she felt a complex mixture of emotions that she had spent years learning to suppress. The familiar sight of aircraft hangars stretching toward the horizon brought back memories of her own military service, the pride of wearing the uniform, the camaraderie of squadron life, the pure joy of pushing a fighter jet through the clouds at twice the speed of sound. But those memories were accompanied by the bitter knowledge that she would never again experience those feelings as anything more than an observer. Her supervisor, Staff Sergeant Carlos Martinez, was a career NCO who had been managing base facilities for over 15 years. He was efficient, fair, and completely uninterested in the personal histories of his civilian employees. When Diana appeared at his office that first morning, he handed her a set of keys, a detailed cleaning schedule, and a brief orientation packet. "Night shift runs from 2200 to 0600, Martinez explained, his tone businesslike but not unkind. "You'll be responsible for hangars 7 through 12, the pilot ready rooms, and the squadron administrative offices. Security will escort you for the first week until your clearance is fully processed. After that, you'll work independently." Questions? Diana had only one question, though she phrased it carefully. "Will I be working around the aircraft?" Martinez looked up from his paperwork, noting something in her voice that suggested more than casual curiosity. "Sometimes. The hangars are active facilities, so you'll be cleaning around whatever aircraft are scheduled for maintenance." "Why?" "Just wanted to know what to expect," Diana replied, though the truth was that she needed to know whether she would be able to handle the emotional impact of being so close to the machines she had once commanded. "I understand there are security protocols." "Strict ones," Martinez confirmed. "You're not to touch any aircraft equipment or classified materials. You clean around them, not on them. Pilots and crew chiefs will sometimes be working late. Stay out of their way and let them focus on their jobs. Most of them won't even notice you're there." Those last words had proven to be prophetic. Over the following months and years, Diana discovered that her supervisor had been absolutely correct. She was effectively invisible to the military personnel who worked in the hangars. To them, she was simply part of the facility infrastructure. As unremarkable as the fluorescent lights or the ventilation systems, the work itself was physically demanding but straightforward. Diana's assigned route took her through some of the most secure areas on the base, where she cleaned offices filled with classified flight manuals, mission planning documents, and technical specifications that were theoretically beyond her security clearance to read. But no one thought to monitor the cleaning lady who emptied the wastebaskets and mopped the floors, and Diana found herself inadvertently absorbing information about aircraft capabilities, mission parameters, and tactical procedures simply by doing her job thoroughly. Her first close encounter with an F-22 Raptor had occurred during her second week on the job. She had been cleaning Hangar 9 when she rounded a corner and found herself face to face with the angular, predatory silhouette of the world's most advanced fighter jet. The aircraft was positioned under bright work lights, its stealth coating giving it an almost alien appearance that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Diana had stopped dead in her tracks, her cleaning cart forgotten as she stared at the machine. The F-22 was unlike anything she had ever seen, sleeker and more sophisticated than the CF-18 she had flown, with lines and angles that spoke of technologies that had barely existed during her active service. But beneath the advanced exterior, she could see the fundamental principles that governed all fighter aircraft: the careful balance of power and aerodynamics, the integration of weapons and sensors, the endless compromises between competing design requirements. "Hey, lady." A voice had called out sharply, "You're not supposed to be here." Diana had turned to see a young crew chief approaching, his expression a mixture of suspicion and annoyance. "I'm sorry," she had said, gesturing to her cleaning supplies. "I'm just doing my assigned rounds." The crew chief had looked her over skeptically before checking his watch. "Fine, but stay away from the aircraft. And be quick about it. We've got pilots coming in for a briefing in 20 minutes. That encounter had established the pattern for Diana's interactions with the active military personnel on the base. She was tolerated as long as she remained inconspicuous, but any sign that she was paying attention to the aircraft or operations around her was met with suspicion and mild hostility. The message was clear. She was there to clean, not to observe, and certainly not to understand. Over the months that followed, Diana had learned to perfect the art of invisible observation. She had developed techniques for appearing completely focused on her cleaning tasks while actually studying the aircraft and equipment around her. She had learned to recognize the different pilots by their voices and their habits, to understand the rhythms of flight operations, and to identify the subtle signs that indicated when something was wrong with an aircraft or a mission. The pilots themselves had gradually become accustomed to her presence, though they rarely acknowledged her directly. She was the night cleaning lady, a fixture in their environment, who appeared after hours to maintain their facilities and disappeared before the day shift arrived. Some were polite enough to nod when they passed her in the corridors. Others simply ignored her completely. A few seemed actively annoyed by her presence, as if the sight of a middle-aged civilian woman in their high-tech military environment somehow diminished the exclusivity of their world. Diana had learned to read their attitudes and adjust her behavior accordingly. Around the friendlier personnel, she allowed herself to work more naturally, occasionally offering a quiet "good evening" or a respectful nod. Around those who seemed uncomfortable with her presence, she made herself as invisible as possible, cleaning efficiently and silently until they had moved on to other areas. But regardless of how they treated her, Diana had never lost sight of why she had taken the job. Every night, as she moved through the hangars surrounded by some of the most sophisticated aircraft ever built, she felt a connection to the world she had lost. She might not be able to fly these machines, but she could at least be near them, could learn from them, could maintain some small link to the profession that had once defined her identity. She had told herself that this proximity was enough, that simply being part of the aviation community in whatever capacity available to her would satisfy the needs that had driven her throughout her adult life. She had convinced herself that she had found peace with her role as an observer rather than a participant. She had been wrong, though she wouldn't discover that fact until the night when circumstances would force her to choose between maintaining her comfortable invisibility and stepping forward to demonstrate skills that she had spent 23 years keeping hidden from the world. The first real confrontation had come during Diana's third month at Crimson Valley, on a particularly busy Thursday night when the 77th Tactical Fighter Wing was preparing for a major training exercise called Operation Desert Thunder. The hangars buzzed with activity well past normal hours as ground crews performed last-minute maintenance checks and pilots conducted final briefings for the dawn sorties. Diana was methodically cleaning the pilot-ready room in Hangar 7 when she overheard a heated discussion between two F-22 pilots and their crew chief about a persistent avionics malfunction that had been plaguing aircraft. Tail number 054087. The pilots, Captain Jake Viper Morrison and Lieutenant Sarah Phoenix Chun, were frustrated because the problem only manifested during certain flight conditions and couldn't be replicated on the ground. The radar warning receiver keeps giving false positives above 28,000 feet, Morrison was saying, his voice tight with irritation. It's like the system thinks we're being painted by enemy radar when there's nothing out there. Diagnostics show green across the board, the crew chief replied, spreading technical manuals across the briefing table. We've run every test in the book. The RWR components check out. The antenna arrays are clean, and the software is up to date. Diana continued dusting the chairs around their table, moving with the practiced invisibility she had perfected over the months. But her trained ear had immediately identified the problem they were describing. She had encountered similar issues during her time flying CF-18s, a phenomenon caused by electromagnetic interference between the radar warning receiver and the caused by electromagnetic interference. Aircraft's own active electronically scanned array radar when operating at specific altitudes and power settings. Maybe it's crosstalk between the APG-77 and the RWR antenna array, Diana said quietly, almost without thinking. The conversation stopped abruptly. All three military personnel turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from surprise to outright hostility. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Diana realized she had made a serious mistake by speaking up. "Excuse me?" Captain Morrison's voice was cold and sharp. "Did the cleaning lady just try to diagnose our aircraft?" Diana's face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just what?" Lieutenant Chun interrupted, her tone dripping with condescension. "Just happened to overhear a conversation about classified avionics systems and thought you'd share your expert opinion." The crew chief, Staff Sergeant Williams, looked Diana up and down with obvious disdain. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you're here to empty trash cans, not to provide technical advice on multi-million-dollar fighter jets." "I understand," Diana said softly, gripping her cleaning cloth tighter. "I apologize for overstepping, but Captain Morrison wasn't finished." "No, I don't think you do understand. Do you have any idea what we're dealing with here? This is an F-22 Raptor, the most advanced air superiority fighter ever built. The systems we're discussing are classified at levels that require years of training and security clearances that you couldn't even comprehend. The woman probably thinks radar is something you use to catch speeders," Lieutenant Chun added with a cruel laugh. "Next thing you know, she'll be offering to fly the mission for us." Staff Sergeant Williams joined in the mockery. "Yeah, maybe we should put her in the cockpit. I'm sure watching Top Gun a few times qualifies her for combat operations." Diana felt her cheeks burning with humiliation, but she forced herself to remain calm. "You're absolutely right. I'm sorry for speaking out of turn." "Damn right we're right," Morrison continued, his voice growing louder and attracting attention from other personnel in the hangar. "This isn't some civilian airport where you can chat with the mechanics about engine troubles. This is a military installation dealing with national defense, and you're here because you clean floors, not because anyone values your opinion on anything more complex than which mop to use." The laughter that followed was sharp and cutting. Other pilots and ground crew members had begun to gather around, drawn by the commotion. Diana could see the mixture of amusement and superiority in their faces as they watched the middle-aged cleaning lady being put in her place by the elite fighter pilots. "I heard she tried to give technical advice," one of the newly arrived pilots said with obvious glee. "The cleaning lady thinks she knows about radar systems. Probably learned everything she knows from watching the Discovery Channel," another voice added, triggering more laughter. Lieutenant Chun leaned back in her chair with a smirk. "You know what? Maybe we should start a suggestion box for the cleaning staff. I'm sure they have lots of ideas about how we could improve our combat effectiveness." "Oh, I've got a better idea," Morrison said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Why don't we make her an honorary squadron member? We could get her one of those little plastic wings they give to kids on commercial flights." The mockery continued for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. Diana stood frozen in place, enduring the verbal assault while maintaining what dignity she could. She had experienced similar treatment during her court-martial proceedings years earlier, but this felt different, more personal, and more cruel, because it was based on assumptions about her background and capabilities rather than on actual knowledge of her actions. "Look at her," Staff Sergeant Williams said with obvious satisfaction. "She's finally figured out where she belongs in the food chain around here." "Good," Captain Morrison replied. "Maybe now she'll stick to cleaning and leave the thinking to people who actually went to school for it." When the group finally dispersed, returning to their technical discussions and pre-flight preparations, Diana was left alone with her cleaning cart and her wounded pride. She mechanically resumed her dusting, but her hands were shaking slightly from the combination of anger and humiliation she felt. The worst part wasn't the mockery itself. Diana had developed thick skin during her years of working in male-dominated environments. What hurt most was the casual dismissal of her intelligence and experience, based solely on her current job title. These pilots and crew members had looked at her and seen nothing more than an uneducated woman who pushed a mop for a living. They couldn't conceive that she might have knowledge or experience that rivaled their own. Over the following weeks, word of the incident spread throughout the base. Diana became known as the cleaning lady who thinks she's a pilot, a source of ongoing amusement for the personnel of the 77th Tactical Fighter Wing. Pilots would sometimes make exaggerated technical comments when she was within earshot, followed by snickers and knowing looks. Ground crew members would occasionally ask her mock-serious questions about aircraft systems, then laugh when she didn't respond. The harassment wasn't constant or overtly malicious, but it was persistent, enough to make Diana's work environment uncomfortable. She learned to time her cleaning rounds to avoid the periods when pilots were most likely to be in the ready rooms. She perfected the art of becoming invisible, moving through her assigned areas with such quiet efficiency that most personnel forgot she was even there, but the damage to her confidence was significant. Diana found herself second-guessing every observation she made about the aircraft around her. When she noticed potential maintenance issues or heard discussions of technical problems that she might be able to help solve, she forced herself to remain silent. The cost of speaking up again seemed too high to risk. She began to understand that her position at Crimson Valley was not just about cleaning. It was about knowing her place in a rigid hierarchy that had no room for someone like her. She was expected to be grateful for the opportunity to work around the aircraft she loved, and to never forget that her role was to serve, not to contribute. The irony was not lost on her that many of the pilots who mocked her expertise were younger than she was and had fewer total flight hours than she had accumulated during her military service. But those facts were irrelevant in an environment where credentials and current status mattered more than actual knowledge or experience. Diana resolved to accept her situation with grace and dignity. She would do her job well, stay out of everyone's way, and find satisfaction in simply being part of the aviation community in whatever capacity was available to her. She convinced herself that the occasional humiliation was a small price to pay for the privilege of working around the aircraft that still captured her imagination every night. She had no way of knowing that her enforced silence was about to be shattered by circumstances that would make her technical knowledge not just relevant, but absolutely critical to the survival of everyone on the base. In the months following the humiliating confrontation in Hangar 7, Diana retreated into a carefully constructed shell of professional invisibility. She arrived for her shifts precisely at 2,200 hours, collected her cleaning supplies from the storage room, and moved through her assigned routes with the silent efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate hostile territory. But beneath this veneer of submissive compliance, Diana's mind remained as sharp and observant as it had ever been during her active flying days. The cruel irony of her situation was that the very people who had mocked her supposed ignorance were unknowingly providing her with an advanced education in modern fighter aircraft operations. Night after night, as she moved through the hangars and ready rooms with her cleaning cart, Diana absorbed information that would have been invaluable to any aviation enthusiast and was absolutely crucial to someone with her Background and hidden expertise. The pilots of the 77th Tactical Fighter Wing had grown so accustomed to her presence that they discussed classified mission parameters, aircraft limitations, and tactical procedures with complete freedom while she worked around them. To them, she had become part of the background infrastructure, as unremarkable and unthinking as the ventilation systems or the fluorescent lighting. They never imagined that the woman emptying their wastebaskets was mentally cataloging every detail of their conversations. Diana learned that the F-22s at Crimson Valley were experiencing unusual stress fractures in their wing root structures due to the extreme temperature variations of desert operations. She discovered that the pilots were frustrated by software glitches in the aircraft's threat warning systems that created false alarms during low-altitude penetration exercises. She overheard detailed discussions about the Raptor's classified radar cross-section vulnerabilities and the specific countermeasures being developed to address them. More importantly, she began to understand the human dynamics of modern fighter operations. She observed that Captain Morrison, despite his arrogant public persona, was actually one of the more technically competent pilots in the squadron, with an intuitive understanding of his aircraft systems that went beyond what was taught in training manuals. Lieutenant Chen, who had been particularly cruel during Diana's public humiliation, was struggling with confidence issues related to air-to-air combat scenarios and often stayed late reviewing tactical videos and mission recordings. The newest pilot in the squadron, Second Lieutenant Marcus Rookie Thompson, was technically proficient but lacked the situational awareness that came with experience. Diana noticed that he had a tendency to over-rely on his aircraft's automated systems and seemed uncomfortable with manual flight controls during emergency procedures. She watched him practice instrument approaches on the flight simulator night after night, always choosing the same predictable patterns and never challenging himself with the kind of creative problem-solving that real combat situations would demand. Diana also observed the ground crews with professional interest, noting their individual strengths and weaknesses as they maintained the complex aircraft. She saw that Staff Sergeant Williams, who had joined in mocking her technical suggestions, was actually one of the most skilled avionics technicians on the base. His diagnostic abilities were exceptional, but he had a blind spot when it came to electromagnetic interference issues, the very problem Diana had tried to point out during her disastrous intervention months earlier. The crew chief for aircraft 054087, Senior Airman Rodriguez, was meticulous in his maintenance procedures, but tended to focus on individual components rather than considering system-wide interactions. Diana watched him replace the radar warning receiver antenna 3 times over the course of 6 weeks, never recognizing that the problem was caused by interference from the aircraft's own radar system rather than a faulty component. As winter turned to spring at Crimson Valley, Diana began to notice patterns in the base's operations that even the permanent personnel seemed to miss. She observed aircraft reliability decreased significantly during the weeks following major training exercises, suggesting that the stress of intensive operations was causing cumulative damage that wasn't being properly addressed. She noted that pilot performance degraded measurably during periods when the base was hosting visiting dignitaries or conducting formal inspections, indicating that the pressure of external scrutiny was affecting the squadron's effectiveness. Most concerning to Diana was a gradual deterioration in the overall readiness of the 77th Tactical Fighter Wing. Maintenance backlogs were increasing, pilot training hours were being reduced due to budget constraints, and there was a noticeable decline in the coordination between different sections of the base. The symptoms were subtle, the kind of thing that might only be apparent to someone who observed the entire operation from the outside, but they suggested that Crimson Valley was becoming increasingly vulnerable to any kind of serious operational challenge. Diana's unique position as an invisible observer gave her insights that no one else on the base possessed. She saw the big picture while everyone else focused on their individual responsibilities. She understood the aircraft from both a pilot's perspective and a maintainer's viewpoint. She recognized the human factors that affected performance in ways that the official reports and statistics never captured. But perhaps most importantly, Diana was developing an intimate familiarity with the specific F-22 Raptors stationed at Crimson Valley. Each aircraft had its own personality and quirks, subtle differences in handling characteristics and system performance that experienced pilots learned to work with rather than against. Aircraft 054088 had a tendency to pull slightly to the left during high G maneuvers due to a manufacturing variation in its flight control surfaces. Aircraft 054091 had intermittent issues with its environmental control system that caused cockpit temperature fluctuations at high altitudes. Aircraft 054095 had the most responsive controls and the smoothest engine performance, making it the preferred mount for the squadron's most demanding missions. Diana memorized these details with the dedication of a scholar, studying ancient texts. She learned to recognize each aircraft by the sound of its engines, the pattern of its navigation lights, and the subtle variations in its radar signature that were invisible to casual observers. She understood their maintenance histories, their performance characteristics, and their individual strengths and weaknesses better than many of the pilots who flew them regularly. The knowledge she was accumulating went far beyond what any civilian was supposed to possess about military aircraft. If security officials had realized the extent of her understanding, she would have been immediately removed from the base and possibly subjected to investigation. But her carefully maintained facade of ignorant servility protected her from scrutiny. No one suspected that the quiet cleaning lady who nodded respectfully when spoken to and never offered unsolicited opinions was actually conducting an intensive, unauthorized education in advanced fighter aircraft operations during quiet moments in the early morning hours. When the base was between shifts and the hangars were largely empty, Diana would sometimes allow herself to stand near the aircraft and imagine what it would be like to fly them. The F-22s represented a quantum leap beyond anything she had experienced during her military service. Their capabilities were almost supernatural compared to the CF-18s she had once commanded. But underneath the advanced technology, she recognized the fundamental principles that governed all fighter aircraft, the eternal balancing act between power and control, speed and maneuverability, offense and defense. She began to understand that her years of exile from aviation had not diminished her abilities as much as she had feared. The skills and instincts that had made her an exceptional pilot were still there, refined by experience and sharpened by her forced perspective as an outsider looking in. If anything, her unique vantage point had given her insights that active pilots might never develop. But Diana kept these realizations to herself, buried beneath layers of learned helplessness and enforced humility. She had accepted that her flying days were over, that her expertise would remain forever unrecognized, that she would spend the remainder of her career as a silent observer of the world she had once inhabited. She had convinced herself that this proximity to aviation was enough, that simply being near the aircraft she loved was sufficient compensation for everything she had lost. She had no way of knowing that all of this carefully accumulated knowledge was about to become desperately relevant, that circumstances would soon arise that would make her silent observations and unrecognized expertise not just valuable, but absolutely essential to the survival of everyone on the base and potentially thousands of civilians beyond the fence line. The emergency began at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning in late October, when Diana was halfway through her cleaning route in Hangar 12. She had been methodically mopping the floor around a maintenance platform when the base-wide alarm system suddenly erupted in a cacophony of piercing tones that echoed off the concrete walls and steel rafters. The sound was immediately followed by an announcement that sent ice through Diana's veins. Red alert! Red alert. All personnel to battle stations. This is not a drill. Hostile aircraft detected approaching United States airspace. Vector 270. Altitude unknown. Estimated time to intercept 12 minutes. All F-22 pilots report to aircraft immediately. Diana dropped her mop and looked around the hangar in confusion. In her 3 years at Crimson Valley, she had never heard anything more serious than routine training alerts. The base conducted regular exercises, but they were always announced in advance and never triggered the kind of panic she could now hear building throughout the facility. Emergency lighting bathed everything in an ominous red glow as personnel began running between buildings, their voices sharp with urgency and barely controlled fear. The hangar doors began grinding open with mechanical precision, revealing the pre-dawn darkness beyond. Diana could see ground crews swarming around the F-22s parked on the flight line, their movements quick and efficient despite the obvious tension in the air. Fuel trucks raced between aircraft while weapons loading teams prepared to arm the fighters. With live missiles for the first time since Diana had been working at the base, through the open hangar doors, she could see pilots sprinting across the tarmac in their flight suits, helmets tucked under their arms as they headed for their assigned aircraft. But something was wrong with the scene. Instead of the usual complement of 8 F-22s that should have been available for immediate launch, Diana could see only 4 aircraft on the ready line. The others were either undergoing scheduled maintenance or had been grounded due to various technical issues that had accumulated over the past weeks. Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the hangar's public address system, his usual arrogance replaced by crisp professionalism. All available Raptor pilots, this is lead. We have multiple bogies inbound from the northwest, crossing into restricted airspace at high speed. Intelligence suggests these are not commercial aircraft. Repeat, these are not commercial aircraft. We are authorized for weapons free upon positive identification of hostile intent. Diana felt her blood run cold. Multiple hostile aircraft approaching. American airspace could only mean one thing. This was either a coordinated terrorist attack or the opening move of something much larger and more dangerous. Either way, the 4 F-22s at Crimson Valley represented the only immediate defense. For a region that included several major cities and critical infrastructure facilities. But as Diana watched the frantic preparations unfolding around her, she began to notice problems that the stressed personnel seemed to be missing in their rush to respond to the crisis. Aircraft 054088, which she knew had been experiencing intermittent hydraulic issues, was showing telltale signs of fluid leakage near its landing gear. The ground crew was focused on weapons loading and didn't appear to have noticed the problem that could cause catastrophic control failure once the aircraft was airborne. Aircraft 054091 was being prepped by a crew that was obviously unfamiliar with its quirks. Diana could see them struggling with the environmental control system connections, unaware that this particular aircraft required a specific sequence of power-up procedures to avoid the cockpit pressurization problems that had been plaguing it. For weeks, they were about to send a pilot into combat in an aircraft that might lose cabin pressure at high altitude. Most concerning of all was aircraft 054095, the squadron's most reliable fighter, which was being prepared by senior airman Rodriguez. Diana watched in growing alarm as Rodriguez performed his pre-flight checks with obvious haste, skipping several steps in the radar system initialization sequence. She knew from months of observation that this aircraft's APG-77 radar had a tendency to default to an incorrect operating mode if not properly calibrated during startup. The pilot would launch with degraded sensor capability and might not realize the problem until he was already engaged with enemy aircraft. As the minutes ticked by, Diana could hear radio chatter from the control tower indicating that the incoming aircraft were still approaching and had not responded to any attempts at communication. Their flight profile was consistent with military fighters rather than commercial aircraft, and they were maintaining radio silence despite repeated warnings to identify themselves and change course. Estimated time to contact, 8 minutes. Came another announcement over the base public address system. All non-essential personnel take cover in designated shelters. This is not a drill. Diana found herself torn between following the evacuation procedures and staying to observe what was happening with the aircraft preparations. She had no official role in the crisis response, no authority to intervene, and certainly no right to be anywhere near the flight line during actual combat operations. But she also knew that the pilots were about to launch an aircraft with serious unaddressed problems that could prove fatal once they encountered enemy fighters. The ground crews were working with desperate efficiency, but they were focused on getting the aircraft airborne as quickly as possible, rather than ensuring they were properly configured for combat. In their haste to respond to the immediate threat, they were overlooking details that could make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Diana watched Lieutenant Chun sprint toward aircraft 054088, obviously unaware of the hydraulic leak that was steadily worsening as the aircraft systems came online. Second Lieutenant Thompson was climbing into 054091, having been briefed on the mission but not on his aircraft's environmental control problems. Captain Morrison was conducting his pre-flight checks on 054095, trusting that his ground crew had properly configured all systems despite their obvious rush. The fourth pilot, Major Patricia Hawk Davis, the squadron's most experienced combat veteran, was preparing to launch an aircraft 054087, the same fighter that had been experiencing radar warning receiver problems for months. Diana knew that this aircraft's threat detection systems were unreliable, potentially leaving its pilot vulnerable to incoming missiles without adequate warning. As she stood in the hangar doorway watching these preparations unfold, Diana felt a growing sense of dread that had nothing to do with the approaching enemy aircraft. The real threat might not be the unknown fighters heading toward American airspace. It might be the cascade of equipment failures that was about to claim the lives of 4 highly trained pilots who were launching into combat with aircraft that weren't properly prepared for the mission. The irony was devastating. Diana possessed detailed knowledge of every problem affecting these aircraft. She had observed and mentally cataloged their individual quirks and maintenance issues over months of careful observation. She understood their systems better than most of the ground crews who were currently preparing them for what might be the most important mission in Crimson Valley's history. But she was just the cleaning lady. She had no credentials, no authority, and no credibility with the personnel who were making life and death decisions. Her previous attempt to offer technical advice had been met with humiliation and mockery. There was no reason to believe that anyone would listen to her now, in the midst of a genuine emergency, when every second counted and the stakes couldn't be higher. 6 minutes to contact, came another announcement. All aircraft proceed to immediate launch. Diana stood frozen in the hangar doorway, watching the final preparations for a mission that she was convinced would end in disaster. The question that tormented her was whether she could live with herself if she remained silent while 4 pilots launched to their deaths in aircraft that she knew were not ready for combat. The answer, she realized with crystalline clarity, was that she could not. Diana's worst fears began materializing within minutes of the F-22's launch. She had positioned herself near the control tower's external speakers, abandoning any pretense of following evacuation procedures as she listened to the unfolding disaster with growing horror. The 4 Raptors had successfully taken off, but the problems she had observed during their hasty preparation were already manifesting in ways that threatened not just the mission, but the lives of every pilot in the air. Viper 2, this is Viper. Lead, Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, tension evident despite his attempt to maintain professional composure. I'm showing intermittent radar contacts. My scope keeps cycling between acquisition and loss of target. Can you confirm bogey positions? Lieutenant Chun's response came through with barely controlled panic in her voice. Viper lead, Viper 2. I'm experiencing severe control problems. Hydraulic pressure is fluctuating wildly. I may need to RTB immediately. Diana closed her eyes in anguish. Aircraft 5 to 4088's hydraulic leak was now manifesting at altitude under combat stress. Exactly as she had feared. Chun was flying a fighter that could lose flight control authority at any moment, and she was expected to engage enemy aircraft in that condition. The radio chatter continued, painting an increasingly desperate picture. Viper 4, this is Viper 3, came Second Lieutenant Thompson's voice, strained with effort. I'm having trouble with cabin pressurization. My oxygen partial pressure is all over the place. I'm getting hypoxia warnings. Major Davis's voice cut through the confusion with the authority of her combat experience, but even she couldn't mask her growing concern. All Vipers, this is Viper 4. We need to sort out these system problems fast. I'm tracking at least 6 inbound hostiles, altitude 35,000, speed Mach 1.8. They'll be in weapons range in 3 minutes. In the control tower, Diana could see the silhouettes of officers and controllers frantically working there. Stations. Through the large windows, she watched Colonel James Harrison, the base commander, pacing behind the air traffic controllers while holding a secure telephone to his ear. His conversation was clearly with higher command authorities, and from his gestures and body language, Diana could tell he was receiving pressure to resolve the situation quickly. Sir, we need to abort the intercept, came the voice of the air operations officer over the radio. 3 of our 4 aircraft are experiencing critical system failures. We should recall them and scramble backup fighters from Nellis. Colonel Harrison grabbed a microphone from one of the controllers. Negative, Major. Nellis is 40 minutes out. We don't have 40 minutes. These aircraft crossed into restricted airspace 12 minutes ago, and they're maintaining their heading toward the Las Vegas metropolitan area. We have to assume hostile intent. Diana watched through the tower windows as various specialists tried to provide technical support to the struggling pilots. The avionics technicians were pulling up diagnostic manuals and consulting with maintenance personnel about the radar problems affecting Morrison's aircraft. The flight surgeon was advising Thompson on emergency oxygen procedures to combat his pressurization issues. The hydraulic specialists were trying to walk Chun through emergency backup procedures for her failing flight controls, but none of these experts possessed the comprehensive understanding that Diana had developed through months of careful observation. They were approaching each problem in isolation, following standard troubleshooting procedures that didn't account for the specific quirks and interaction effects that characterized these particular aircraft. Viper lead, this is Tower, the air traffic controller's voice was tense with urgency. Be advised, hostile aircraft are now within 50 miles of civilian population centers. You are cleared to engage with weapons-free authorization. Morrison's response revealed the full extent of the crisis. Tower, Viper lead. I can't get a solid radar lock. My system keeps defaulting to training mode, and I can't manually override. I'm essentially flying blind up here. Diana felt sick. She had watched Rodriguez skip the radar initialization sequence that would have prevented exactly this problem. Morrison was trying to engage enemy fighters with a sensor system that was operating in the wrong configuration, making him nearly useless in the air-to-air combat role. The situation deteriorated further when Chun's voice came over the radio, now clearly fighting to maintain control of her aircraft. All stations, Viper 2 declaring emergency. I've lost primary hydraulic pressure and backup system is not responding properly. I'm having trouble maintaining level flight. In the tower, Diana could see Colonel Harrison conferring urgently with his operations staff. Through the glass she watched in point at a large situational display, showing the positions of both friendly and hostile aircraft. The unknown fighters were continuing their approach toward populated areas, while the F-22s that were supposed to intercept them were falling apart in the air. "Sir," came the voice of the operations officer, "we need to consider evacuation procedures for Las Vegas. If those aircraft are carrying weapons of mass destruction, ... Absolutely not," Harrison cut him off. "We are not going to panic 600,000 civilians based on speculation. Our pilots will complete their mission." But the pilots were in no condition to complete anything. Thompson's voice came over the radio, now slurred with the effects of oxygen deprivation. "Tower. Viper. 3. Having trouble thinking clearly. Oxygen system not working right. May need to descend." The flight surgeon immediately responded. "Viper 3. Descend to 15,000 feet immediately and switch to emergency oxygen. Do not attempt to engage hostile aircraft in your current condition." That left only Major Davis with a fully functional aircraft, and even she was flying the F-22 with the faulty radar warning receiver that Diana knew could leave her vulnerable to incoming missiles. 1 pilot against 6 enemy fighters was not odds that anyone in the tower wanted to contemplate. Diana watched the base commander make a series of increasingly desperate phone calls, presumably to other military installations and higher command authorities. She could see him gesturing emphatically, clearly arguing for additional support that wasn't immediately available. The rigid hierarchy of military command was working against them now. Every decision had to be approved through channels. Every request for assistance had to be justified and processed, while the clock continued ticking down toward what looked like an inevitable catastrophe. "Colonel," the air operations officer called out, "I'm showing the hostile aircraft have split into 2 formations. 4 are continuing toward Las Vegas, but 2 have broken off and appear to be heading toward Hoover Dam." The implications were staggering. If hostile aircraft reached either target, the consequences would be devastating. Las Vegas represented hundreds of thousands of civilian lives, while Hoover Dam controlled water and power for much of the southwestern United States. The loss of either target would be a national catastrophe. "How long until other fighters can reach intercept position?" Harrison demanded. "Nellis reports their alert birds are airborne, but they're still 35 minutes out from intercept. Luke Air Force Base is scrambling additional aircraft, but they're even further away." Harrison slammed his fist down on the control console. 35 minutes. We don't have 35 minutes. The radio crackled with Morrison's increasingly frustrated voice. "Tower, Viper lead. I still can't get my radar to lock onto anything. I need technical assistance or I'm completely ineffective up here." "Viper 2 here," Chon added, her voice tight with strain. "I'm losing hydraulic fluid fast. I don't think I can maintain altitude much longer." Thompson's condition was even worse. "Viper 3... can't seem to. Having trouble concentrating. What was I supposed to be doing?" Deanna stood outside the control tower, listening to the systematic breakdown of what should have been a routine interception mission. The most advanced fighter aircraft in the world were being rendered useless by maintenance problems that she had identified and could have prevented. The experts inside the tower, experienced officers, skilled technicians, and trained specialists were following standard procedures that weren't adequate for the unique combination of problems affecting these specific aircraft. She realized with crystal clarity that the authority figures who had dismissed her months earlier were now failing catastrophically when it mattered most. Their expertise was real, but it was limited by their adherence to official procedures and their inability to see the bigger picture that her unique position had revealed to her. The hostile aircraft were now 28 minutes from their targets. 3 of the 4 defending fighters were effectively out of action, and the people in charge had no solutions that could bridge the gap between the current crisis and the arrival of reinforcements. Diana looked up at the control tower windows, knowing that inside that building were the same officers who had humiliated her for daring to offer technical advice. They were now facing the consequences of a system that valued credentials over competence, hierarchy over expertise, and protocol over practical knowledge. The time for following proper channels and respecting authority had run out. Diana stood at the base of the control tower for what felt like an eternity, listening to the radio chatter that painted an increasingly hopeless picture. Every instinct screamed at her to act, but the memory of her previous humiliation held her frozen in place. She was just the cleaning lady. Who would listen to her now, in the middle of a genuine national security crisis, when trained military professionals with decades of experience were already working the problem? But as she heard Lieutenant Chun's labored breathing over the radio and Morrison's continued frustration with his malfunctioning radar, Diana realized that her fear of embarrassment was a luxury the country couldn't afford. 6 hostile aircraft were bearing down on American soil. 3 of the 4 defending fighters were critically compromised, and the experts in the tower running out of time and options. Diana took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked purposefully toward the control tower entrance. The security guard at the door, Sergeant Mike Foster, had seen her around the base for 3 years, but had never paid her much attention. Now he looked up from his logbook with surprise as she approached during what was clearly a restricted access situation. "Ma'am, you need to be in the designated shelter areas," Foster said, his tone polite but firm. "This area is off-limits to civilian personnel during red alert status." "I need to speak with Colonel Harrison immediately," Diana said, her voice calm but carrying an authority that made Foster pause. "It's about the aircraft system failures." Foster's expression shifted from polite dismissal to confusion. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand the situation. We're dealing with a national security emergency here. The colonel doesn't have time." "To Sergeant Foster," Diana interrupted, her tone becoming more insistent. "In approximately 25 minutes, those hostile aircraft are going to reach their targets because our pilots can't engage them effectively. I know why their systems are failing, and I know how to fix them." Something in Diana's voice, a confidence and technical precision that didn't match her janitor's uniform, made Foster hesitate. He had been trained to follow protocol, but he had also been trained to recognize when exceptional circumstances might require exceptional decisions. "Ma'am, I need you to understand that I could lose my security clearance for this," Foster said slowly. "But if you really think you can help ... double quotes," he reached for his radio. "Tower, this is entry control. I have a civilian here who claims to have information relevant to the current aircraft problems." The response was immediate and sharp. "Entry control, this is not the time for civilians to be offering suggestions. Direct all non-essential personnel to shelter areas immediately." Diana stepped closer to Foster's radio. "Tell them Diana Kellerman needs to speak with Colonel Harrison about the radar initialization sequence on aircraft 054095, the hydraulic bypass procedure for 054088, and the environmental control calibration for 054091. Foster stared at her in shock. The level of technical detail she had just rattled off was not something any civilian should know, let alone a cleaning lady. But before he could respond, Colonel Harrison's voice came directly over the radio. "Entry control, send her up immediately." The elevator ride to the control tower felt like the longest 90 seconds of Diana's life. As the doors opened, she found herself facing a room full of uniformed officers and technicians, all of whom turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. The control room was a maze of electronic displays, communications equipment, and plotting boards showing the positions of both friendly and hostile aircraft. Colonel Harrison stood in the center of the chaos, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His eyes were red with fatigue and stress, And when he looked at Diana, she could see the desperation of a commander who was watching his mission fall apart in real time. "You're the cleaning lady who thinks she knows about aircraft systems," Harrison said, his voice carrying no mockery but also no warmth. "I've got pilots dying up there and hostile aircraft threatening American cities. If you've got something useful to say it fast." Diana felt every eye in the room focused on her, including several faces she recognized from her previous humiliation months earlier. Captain Morrison's ground crew was there, along with the avionics specialists who had been trying unsuccessfully to diagnose the radar problems. She could see skepticism and barely concealed annoyance in their expressions. "Colonel," Diana began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "your pilots are experiencing cascade failures because your ground crews rushed through pre-flight procedures without accounting for the specific maintenance histories of these aircraft." "Get to the point," Harrison snapped. "Aircraft 5 to 4095's radar is defaulting to training mode because the initialization sequence was interrupted during startup. Captain Morrison needs to cycle his master radar switch off for 15 seconds, then back on while simultaneously pressing the system reset button and the mode select button. That will force a complete restart and restore full combat functionality." The silence in the room was deafening. Then one of the avionics technicians, Staff Sergeant Martinez, spoke up with obvious skepticism. "Ma'am, that's not a standard procedure. If we give the wrong instructions to a pilot in combat... It's not a standard procedure because it's specific to that aircraft." Diana cut him off. 054095 has had intermittent radar control unit problems for 8 months. I've watched your team work on it 17 times. The standard restart procedure doesn't clear the memory buffer completely, which is why the system keeps reverting to training mode under stress." Colonel Harrison looked from Diana to his technicians and back again. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I've been watching and listening for 3 years. Diana replied simply. "Aircraft 054088's hydraulic problem isn't just a leak. It's a cascade failure in the backup system caused by cross-contamination between primary and secondary circuits. Lieutenant Chun needs to isolate the backup system completely and switch to manual reversion mode for flight controls." The hydraulic specialist, Technical Sergeant Williams, shook his head. "Ma'am, manual reversion in an F-22 requires specialized training. Even experienced pilots rarely practice those procedures." "Lieutenant Chun has practiced them," Diana said with certainty. "I've watched her run manual control simulations every Tuesday night for the past 6 months. She knows the procedures better than any other pilot in the squadron." Harrison grabbed a microphone from the communications console. "Viper 2, this is Tower. Switch to manual reversion mode for your flight controls. Isolate your backup hydraulic system completely." Chun's voice came back immediately, filled with surprise. "Tower, how did you know I was qualified for manual reversion?" Before Harrison could respond, Diana continued with urgent precision. "Aircraft 054091's environmental control system needs to be reset by switching the cabin pressure controller to manual mode, setting it to 14,000 foot equivalent, then slowly bringing it back to automatic. The pressure sensor has been giving false readings for weeks." "And how exactly do you know all this?" demanded Major Patricia Davis, the air operations officer who had been one of Diana's harshest critics months earlier. Diana looked directly at Davis, her voice carrying 3 years of suppressed frustration and 23 years of professional expertise. "Because, Major, I'm not just a cleaning lady. I'm a former Royal Canadian Air Force pilot with over 1,200 hours in fighter aircraft. I was Captain Diana Kellerman before I became the invisible woman who empties your trash cans. And right now, my knowledge of these specific aircraft is the only thing standing between your pilots and a catastrophic mission failure." The room erupted in shocked murmurs and confused conversations. Several officers began talking at once, demanding explanations and questioning Diana's credentials. But Colonel Harrison held up his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Diana's face. "Can you get my pilots back in the fight?" he asked simply. "Yes, sir," Diana replied without hesitation. "But we need to move fast. Those hostile aircraft are 22 minutes from their targets, and your pilots need time to re-engage after we fix their systems." Harrison didn't hesitate. "Do it." For the first time in 3 years, Diana Kellerman was about to return to the world of military aviation, not as a pilot, but as the technical expert whose knowledge could save not just 4 aircraft, but potentially thousands of civilian lives. The cleaning lady who had been mocked and dismissed was about to remind everyone in that control tower that expertise comes in many forms, and sometimes salvation arrives in the most unexpected packages. Diana moved to the primary communications console with the confidence of someone who belonged there, her 3 years of enforced invisibility falling away like a discarded disguise. Colonel Harrison stepped aside, giving her access to the radio controls while the room full of officers and technicians watched in stunned silence. The skeptical murmurs died away as Diana adjusted the headset and keyed the microphone with the practiced ease of someone who had commanded aircraft in combat situations. "Viper lead, this is Diana." Her voice carried across the radio waves with calm authority. "I need you to perform a complete radar system restart. Are you ready to copy instructions?" Captain Morrison's response crackled through the speakers, his voice tight with confusion and desperation. "Tower, who is this? I don't recognize the call sign. I'm still unable to acquire targets and those bogies are closing fast." "Captain Morrison, this is someone who knows your aircraft better than you do right now," Diana replied, her tone gentle but firm. "I need you to trust me. We're going to fix your radar problem, but you need to follow my instructions exactly. Time is critical." In the control room, Technical Sergeant Martinez moved closer to Diana's position, his earlier skepticism now replaced by intense curiosity. "Ma'am, if you're wrong about this procedure—" "I'm not wrong," Diana said quietly, covering the microphone momentarily. "I've watched this exact problem develop over 8 months. I know the system architecture of that radar better than the manual." She keyed the microphone again. "Viper lead, locate your master radar control switch on the left side of your instrument. Panel, position 7 Alpha." "Roger, I've got it," Morrison replied. "Switch it to the off position and hold it there for exactly 15 seconds. While you're counting, I need you to simultaneously locate the system reset button. That's the small red button directly below the radar scope, and the mode select button, which is the large toggle switch to the right of your scope." Diana watched the control room's radar displays as Morrison's aircraft signature temporarily disappeared from secondary tracking systems, indicating that his radar had indeed gone offline. The avionics specialists gathered around her position, following every word with professional fascination and growing respect. 15 seconds completed, Morrison reported. "Perfect. Now, simultaneously press the system reset button and toggle the mode select switch to combat while returning the master switch to gone. You should see a complete system initialization sequence." There was a pause that seemed to stretch forever. Then Morrison's voice came back with barely contained excitement. "Holy shit! I've got full radar functionality. Multiple targets, bearing 270, range 60 miles, angels 35. I have solid locks on all 6 bogies." A cheer went up from the control room, but Diana was already moving to the next crisis. "Viper 2, this is Diana. We're going to solve your hydraulic problem. Are you still maintaining level flight?" Lieutenant Chun's voice was strained but hopeful. "Barely. My controls are getting mushier by the minute. If you can fix this, I'll buy you dinner for a year." Diana allowed herself a small smile. "I'll hold you to that." "Chun, I need you to locate your hydraulic system control panel. You're going to isolate your backup system completely because it's contaminating your primary system. Ma'am, interrupted hydraulic specialist Williams, stepping forward with obvious concern. If she isolates the backup system and then loses primary hydraulics, she have no flight controls at all. Diana turned to face Williams directly. Sergeant, I've watched Lieutenant Chun practice manual reversion procedures every Tuesday night for 6 months. She's logged more simulator time on emergency flight controls than any other pilot in this squadron. She can handle manual reversion if necessary, but the contamination in her backup system is what's causing the primary system to fail. She keyed the microphone again. Viper 2, locate the backup hydraulic isolation valve. That's the red striped handle on your lower left console. I need you to turn it 90 degrees clockwise to the isolated position. Diana, if I do that and lose primary hydraulics ... Chun's voice trailed off. You won't lose primary hydraulics, Diana said with absolute confidence. The pressure fluctuations you're experiencing are caused by the backup system feeding contaminated fluid into the primary system. Once you isolate it, your primary system will stabilize. Another pause, then Chun's voice came back with amazement. Hydraulic pressure is climbing. Primary system is showing normal pressure across all circuits. Controls are firming up. The control room erupted in another cheer, but Diana was already focused on the third crisis. Viper 3, this is Diana. Thompson, I need you to manually reset your environmental control system. Thompson's response was slurred and confused. Diana? Who ... I'm having trouble thinking clearly. Oxygen system isn't working right. Flight Surgeon Captain Reynolds stepped forward with medical authority. Ma'am, that pilot is suffering from hypoxia. He needs to descend immediately to a safe altitude. Doctor, he doesn't have time to descend and climb back up for intercept, Diana replied firmly. The environmental control system is giving false pressure readings. His oxygen supply is actually adequate, but the cabin pressure controller thinks he's at 60,000 feet instead of 35,000. We can fix this in 30 seconds. She keyed the microphone again, her voice taking on the tone of a flight instructor guiding a student through a critical procedure. Thompson, focus on my voice. I need you to find the cabin pressure controller. It's the round dial with numbers on your environmental control panel. Can you see it? Yeah, ... I think so ... Numbers are kind of blurry ... Good. Turn that dial to the manual position. You'll see the pressure reading change immediately. Okay. Turning to manual ... Wait. The pressure reading just dropped to 14,000 feet. I'm feeling better already. Perfect. Now turn it back to automatic slowly. Don't rush it. Automatic ... Yeah, okay. Wow, I can think clearly again. Thanks, whoever you are. Diana's systematic approach was methodical and precise, drawing on months of careful observation and decades of aviation experience. With each successful fix, the skepticism in the control room transformed into amazement and then into professional respect. Officers who had dismissed her as an ignorant civilian were now watching her work with the attention they would give to a master craftsman. Viper 4, this is Diana, she continued, addressing Major Davis in the aircraft with the faulty radar warning receiver. Your threat detection system has been unreliable for months. I can't fix the hardware from here, but I can tell you exactly what to watch for. Major Davis's voice came back with professional courtesy that hadn't been there during Diana's previous humiliation. Go ahead, Diana, I'm listening. Your RWR has a dead zone between bearings 040 and 080 degrees. If you see missiles launching from that sector, you won't get adequate warning. Keep your defensive maneuvering options open. And don't rely solely on your threat receiver. Understood? And Diana, nice work on the other aircraft. Colonel Harrison stepped beside Diana, watching the tactical display that now showed 4 fully functional F-22s closing on the hostile aircraft formation. "How did you know all that?" he asked quietly. Diana looked up at him, her voice carrying 3 years of suppressed frustration and pride. "Colonel, I've spent every night for 3 years watching, listening, and learning. I've observed every maintenance procedure, heard every technical discussion, and tracked every recurring problem. I know these aircraft not just as machines, but as individuals with their own personalities and quirks." She gestured toward the tactical display. "More importantly, I know your pilots. I know their strengths, their training backgrounds, and their capabilities. Chun practices emergency procedures religiously because she's afraid of letting her squadron down. Thompson struggles with confidence but has excellent technical skills when he's thinking clearly. Morrison is naturally gifted but sometimes gets frustrated when technology doesn't work perfectly. Davis has more combat experience than all of them combined and can adapt to any situation." The radio crackled with Morrison's voice, now confident and professional. "Tower, all Vipers are fully mission capable. We have solid radar locks on all 6 hostiles. Requesting permission to engage." Colonel Harrison took the microphone from Diana. "All Vipers, you are cleared to engage, weapons free." Diana stood back from the communications console, watching the tactical display as the 4 blue symbols representing the repaired F-22s moved into attack positions against the 6 red symbols representing the hostile aircraft. Around her, the control room was filled with professional military personnel who were seeing her with completely different eyes than they had just minutes earlier. For the first time in 3 years, Diana Kellerman was no longer invisible. She was no longer just the cleaning lady who emptied trash cans and mopped floors. She was once again what she had always been, a pilot, an expert, and someone whose knowledge and experience could make the difference between success and catastrophe when it mattered most. The tactical display in the control room showed the aerial engagement unfolding in real time, with 4 blue symbols representing the restored F-22 Raptors closing rapidly on 6 red symbols that had been threatening American soil just minutes earlier. Diana watched the electronic representation of the battle with the intensity of someone who understood exactly what each movement meant: the careful positioning for optimal missile shots, the tactical coordination between aircraft, and the split-second decisions that would determine whether the mission succeeded or failed. "Fox 3, Fox 3. Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, announcing the launch of a IM-12 OM-RAM missiles from his fully functional radar system. 2 slammers away, targeting the lead formation. The control room fell into tense silence as everyone watched the display, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether Diana's technical interventions had truly saved the day. The hostile aircraft had maintained their course and speed despite multiple warnings to turn away, confirming their aggressive intent and justifying the decision to engage them with lethal force. "Splash 1, Splash 2, came Morrison's triumphant voice. "Both targets destroyed. Remaining hostiles are breaking formation and turning away from populated areas." Lieutenant Chun's voice followed immediately, her confidence restored along with her aircraft's hydraulic systems. "Viper 2 engaging southern formation. Fox 3 times 2, missiles away." The engagement unfolded with the precision and lethality that the F-22 Raptor had been designed to deliver. Within 6 minutes, all 6 hostile aircraft had been either destroyed or forced to flee American airspace, their threat to Las Vegas and Hoover Dam eliminated completely. The pilots who had been struggling with crippled aircraft just 20 minutes earlier were now reporting mission success with the professional satisfaction of warriors who had defended their homeland. All hostiles eliminated or retreating, Major Davis reported from her position as flight leader. No friendly casualties. All Vipers returning to base for debrief and celebration drinks, and somebody better have a bottle of champagne ready. For Diana. As the immediate crisis passed and the tactical display showed the F-22s beginning their return flight to Crimson Valley, the atmosphere in the control room underwent a complete transformation. The same officers and technicians who had viewed Diana with skepticism and barely concealed hostility were now looking at her with expressions of amazement, respect, and something approaching awe. Colonel Harrison was the first to break the silence, stepping forward to face Diana directly. His weathered face showed the strain of the past hour, but his eyes held a respect that hadn't been there when she first entered the control room. "Ms. Kellerman," he said formally, "on behalf of the United States Air Force and the American people, I want to thank you for what you just accomplished." Technical Sergeant Martinez, who had questioned her radar procedures just minutes earlier, shook his head in disbelief. "Ma'am, I've been working on F-22 avionics for 8 years, and I've never seen anyone diagnose system problems that accurately under pressure. How did you know that radar initialization sequence would work?" Diana's response was simple and direct. "Because I've been watching you work on that problem for months, Sergeant. I've seen you try every standard procedure in the manual, and I've observed when they worked and when they didn't. Sometimes the solution isn't in the official documentation. It's in understanding the individual quirks of a specific aircraft." Flight Surgeon Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his medical training making him naturally curious about human performance under stress. "Diana, what you did with Lieutenant Thompson, talking him through that environmental control reset while he was suffering from hypoxia, that required an understanding not just of aircraft systems, but of pilot psychology and medical factors." "Doctor, I've been a pilot in emergency situations," Diana replied. "I know what it feels like when your thinking becomes unclear due to oxygen problems. I also know that pilots can follow complex procedures even when they're impaired, as long as someone they trust gives them clear, step-by-step instructions." Hydraulic Specialist Williams approached with obvious humility, a stark contrast to his earlier dismissive attitude. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. When you suggested that Lieutenant Chun isolate her backup hydraulic system, I thought you were going to get her killed. But you understood the interaction between those systems better than I did." Diana nodded graciously. "Sergeant Williams, you're an excellent hydraulics technician, but you've been following troubleshooting procedures designed for routine maintenance situations. What Chun was experiencing was a cascade failure that isn't covered in the standard manuals because it's so rare. I only recognized it because I've been observing that particular aircraft for months." The conversations continued as more personnel approached Diana with questions, apologies, and expressions of respect. Major Patricia Davis, who had been particularly harsh during Diana's earlier humiliation, spoke with obvious sincerity when she said, "Diana, I was completely wrong about you. I judged you based on your job title rather than your knowledge, and that was inexcusable." "Major, you were protecting your pilots and your mission," Diana replied diplomatically. "In your position, I would have been skeptical too. But I hope this experience shows that expertise can come from unexpected sources." Colonel Harrison had been quiet during these exchanges, but now he stepped forward with the bearing of a commander making an important decision. "Miss Kellerman, I think we need to have a serious conversation about your future role at this base. What happened here today suggests that we've been wasting a valuable resource." Diana felt a mixture of emotions, vindication, relief, and something she hadn't experienced in years: professional recognition. "Colonel, I appreciate that sentiment, but I need you to understand something. I didn't do this for recognition or to change my position. I did it because those pilots were in danger and I had knowledge that could help them." The control room had gradually filled with additional personnel as word of the successful mission spread throughout the base. Ground crews, maintenance technicians, and off-duty pilots had gathered to hear first-hand accounts of how the cleaning lady had saved the mission. Diana found herself at the center, of attention in a way that felt both gratifying and slightly overwhelming. Captain Morrison's voice came over the radio as the F-22s approached the base for landing. "Tower, this is Viper Lead. I don't know who Diana is or how she knows so much about our aircraft, but she saved our asses today. I owe her a debt I can never repay." Lieutenant Chun's transmission followed immediately. "Tower, Viper 2. That lady is a miracle worker. My aircraft is flying better now than it has in months. Tell her she's got dinner invitations from my family for the rest of her life." Even Second Lieutenant Thompson, whose oxygen-starved condition had made him the most vulnerable during the crisis, managed to express his gratitude. "Tower, Viper 3. Diana, if you're listening, thank you for keeping me alive and clear-headed up there. I don't know how you knew exactly what to do, but you probably saved my life." As Diana listened to these testimonials from the pilots she had helped, she felt a satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. For 3 years, she had watched these men and women from the shadows, learning their strengths and weaknesses, understanding their individual personalities and capabilities. Today, she had been able to use that knowledge to protect them when they needed it most. The base public address system crackled to life with an announcement from Colonel Harrison. "All personnel, this is the base commander. Today's successful defense of American airspace was made possible by the exceptional technical knowledge and quick thinking of Ms. Diana Kellerman. I want every person on this base to understand that heroism comes in many forms, and sometimes the most important contributions come from the most unexpected sources." Diana stood in the control room surrounded by military professionals who now viewed her with the respect that her knowledge and experience deserved. The invisible cleaning lady, who had been mocked and dismissed, had proven that competence and courage don't depend on rank, uniform, or official recognition. She had demonstrated that sometimes the most valuable expertise comes from those who observe carefully, learn continuously, and act decisively when others cannot. For the first time in 3 years, Diana Kellerman was no longer invisible. And for the first time since her court-martial decades earlier, she felt like she belonged in the world of military aviation once again. The transformation began within hours of the successful mission, but Diana first noticed it during the formal debrief session that Colonel Harrison convened immediately after the F-22s landed. Instead of being escorted back to her cleaning duties or politely dismissed as she might have expected, Diana found herself seated at the main conference table in the squadron's briefing room, flanked by pilots, senior officers, and technical specialists who hung on her every word. Captain Morrison sat directly across from her, still wearing his flight suit and carrying his helmet bag. The arrogance that had characterized his previous interactions with Diana had been completely replaced by respectful attention. "Diana, when you told me to cycle the radar system using that specific sequence, how did you know it would work? That's not in any manual I've ever seen." Diana leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who no longer needed to apologize for her expertise. "Captain, aircraft 054095 has a known issue with its radar control unit. Manifests under specific conditions. The standard restart procedure doesn't fully clear the system's memory buffer, so it defaults to training mode when it encounters certain stress parameters. I've watched your ground crews work on this problem repeatedly, and I noticed that the only successful fixes involved complete power cycling of multiple systems simultaneously." Lieutenant Chun, still visibly shaken by her near-catastrophic hydraulic failure, shook her head in amazement. "You saved my life today. That hydraulic contamination problem, how long have you known about it?" "About 6 weeks, Diana replied matter-of-factly. "I first noticed the symptoms when I observed unusual fluid patterns during your post-flight inspections. The backup system was introducing contaminants into the primary circuit during high-stress maneuvers. I actually tried to mention it to your crew chief once, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the reference to her previous humiliation and the systematic dismissal of her observations. Colonel Harrison, who had been taking notes throughout the debrief, looked up with obvious concern. "Miss Kellerman, are you telling us that you've identified other potential safety issues that haven't been addressed?" Diana paused, considering her response carefully. For 3 years, she had accumulated a mental database of maintenance problems, safety concerns, and operational inefficiencies that she had observed but never been able to report through official channels. Now, suddenly, she had an audience of senior officers who not only wanted to hear her observations, but were prepared to act on them. "Colonel, I've observed patterns that suggest several aircraft in your fleet are developing problems that could become serious safety issues if not addressed," Diana said diplomatically. "But I want to be clear that your maintenance crews are excellent at their jobs. The problems I've noticed are subtle, often involving interactions between systems that aren't obvious during routine inspections." Major Davis leaned forward with intense interest. "Give us specifics. What else should we be worried about?" Diana took a deep breath, then began systematically outlining months of careful observations. Aircraft 054089 has been showing signs of engine bearing wear that's progressing faster than normal. The vibration patterns during startup suggest it will need major engine work within the next 200 flight hours. Aircraft 054092 has an intermittent problem with its fly-by-wire flight control system that only manifests during certain atmospheric conditions, specifically when humidity is above 70% and temperature is below 40 degrees. The room fell silent as Diana continued her detailed assessment, describing problems that ranged from minor maintenance issues to potentially catastrophic safety concerns. Technical Sergeant Martinez was frantically taking notes, while hydraulics Specialist Williams listened with the intensity of someone hearing revelations that challenged everything he thought he knew about the aircraft he maintained. "How is this possible?" Williams asked when Diana paused. "I mean, we have comprehensive inspection procedures, diagnostic equipment, and experienced technicians. How did you spot problems that we missed?" Diana's response was both diplomatic and illuminating. "Sergeant Williams, you and your teams are focused on specific systems during specific inspection periods. You're looking for known problems using established procedures. I've had the luxury of observing the entire fleet continuously for 3 years, watching for patterns and anomalies that might not be apparent during routine maintenance windows." She gestured toward the whiteboard where maintenance schedules were displayed. "You inspect each aircraft intensively for short periods. I've been conducting a long-term, low-intensity observation of all aircraft simultaneously. Different perspective, different insights." Colonel Harrison stood up and began pacing, a habit Diana had observed during stressful situations. "This is a paradigm shift for how we think about aircraft maintenance and safety monitoring. Ms. Kellerman, I need to ask you directly, are you interested in a position that would allow you to use these skills officially?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Diana had accepted about her life and career limitations. She looked around the room at faces that showed genuine respect and interest rather than the skepticism and hostility she had endured for years. "Colonel, I appreciate the offer, but there are complications you need to understand," Diana replied carefully. "My military record contains a court-martial that resulted in my discharge from the Royal Canadian Air Force. I'm not eligible for security clearances or official positions that would require background investigations." Major Davis spoke up immediately. "Diana, what was the nature of your court-martial? Because based on what we've seen today, it's hard to imagine you doing anything that would justify ending your military career." Diana's expression grew distant as she recalled events from decades earlier. "I violated direct orders during a training exercise to help a wingman who was experiencing an emergency. My actions saved his life but were deemed insubordinate by my commanding officer. The military justice system didn't recognize a distinction between successful outcomes and proper procedure. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Everyone in the room had experience with military hierarchy and the sometimes brutal enforcement of discipline over common sense. Captain Morrison was the first to speak. "Diana, that's not a black mark against your character. That's proof that you put lives over politics. If anything, it makes me trust you more, not less." Lieutenant Chun nodded emphatically. "After what you did for us today, I don't care what some court-martial board decided 20 years ago. You're the kind of person I want watching out for pilot safety." Colonel Harrison stopped pacing and faced Diana directly. "Ms. Kellerman, I can't change your official status or security clearance limitations, but I can create a civilian consultant position that would allow you to work directly with our maintenance and safety teams. You'd be reporting problems and observations to people who will take them seriously and act on them immediately." The offer represented everything. Diana had lost decades earlier and had convinced herself she would never regain professional recognition, meaningful work in aviation, and the opportunity to use her expertise to protect pilots and aircraft. But it also represented a fundamental change in how she saw herself and her place in the world. "I need some time to think about it," Diana said finally. "This is a significant change from my current situation." "Of course," Harrison replied, "but I want you to understand something. What happened here today wasn't just about fixing broken aircraft. You demonstrated a level of situational awareness and technical expertise that's rare in any field. We'd be fools not to find a way to utilize those capabilities officially." As the debrief session concluded and personnel began filing out of the room, Diana remained seated, processing the magnitude of what had occurred. In the span of a few hours, she had gone from invisible cleaning lady to recognized expert, from dismissed outsider to valued consultant, from someone whose opinions were mocked to someone whose insights were actively sought. The transformation was more than professional, it was personal. For the first time in years, Diana felt like herself again. Not the diminished version of herself that had been shaped by years of hiding her capabilities, but the confident, competent professional she had been before circumstances forced her into exile from the aviation world. As she finally stood to leave the briefing room, Diana realized that today had changed more than just her job prospects. It had restored her sense of identity and purpose. She was no longer pretending to be someone she wasn't. She was Diana Kellerman, pilot and aviation expert, and the world was finally ready to accept her as exactly that. 6 months after the crisis, that changed everything. Diana Kellerman walked through the hangars of Crimson Valley Air Force Base, wearing a different kind of uniform, not the navy blue coveralls of a cleaning lady, but the khaki shirt and dark trousers of a civilian technical consultant. Her badge now reads Senior Aviation Safety Specialist, and the respect she commanded was evident in every interaction she had with military personnel throughout the base. The transformation had been gradual but profound. Colonel Harrison had made good on his promise to create an official position that utilized Diana's unique skills, though the process had required navigating significant bureaucratic obstacles. Her court-martial record had indeed prevented her from obtaining a security clearance, but Harrison had worked with Air Force Personnel Command to establish a civilian consulting role that allowed her to contribute without requiring access to classified information. Diana's new office was located in the same building where she had once stored her cleaning supplies, but now it was equipped with computer terminals displaying real-time aircraft status information, maintenance scheduling systems, and diagnostic equipment that allowed her to analyze the patterns she had been observing informally for years. The walls were covered with technical diagrams, aircraft system schematics, and a large whiteboard where she tracked long-term trends in aircraft performance across the entire fleet. The impact of her work extended far beyond the dramatic crisis that had brought her expertise to light. In the months following her appointment, Diana had identified 17 potential safety issues that might have led to catastrophic failures if left unaddressed. Her comprehensive understanding of aircraft systems, combined with her unique perspective as a long-term observer, had prevented what could have been multiple pilot fatalities and aircraft losses. More importantly, Diana had fundamentally changed how Crimson Valley approached aircraft maintenance and safety monitoring. She had established a program that she called Continuous Fleet Observation, which trained ground crews and support personnel to watch for the subtle patterns and anomalies that traditional inspection procedures might miss. Mechanics who had previously focused solely on their specific responsibilities were now encouraged to share observations about any aspect of aircraft performance or behavior that seemed unusual. The success of Diana's program had attracted attention from the highest levels of the Air Force hierarchy. General Patricia Hamilton, the commander of Air Combat Command, had visited Crimson Valley personally to observe Diana's methods and had subsequently ordered similar programs to be established at F-22 bases throughout the service. What had begun as one woman's attempt to help during the crisis had evolved into a new approach to aviation safety that was being adopted across the entire fighter aircraft community. But perhaps the most significant change was in the culture of the base itself. The rigid hierarchy that had once dismissed Disona's contributions based on her job title had been replaced by an environment where expertise was recognized and valued regardless of its source. Young airmen were encouraged to speak up when they noticed problems. Maintenance personnel were asked to share their observations with supervisors, and even civilian contractors were treated as valuable members of the safety team. Captain Morrison, who had been promoted to major following his successful engagement with the hostile aircraft, often visited Diana's office to discuss aircraft performance issues and to seek her advice on technical problems. The arrogance that had once characterized his interactions with support personnel had been replaced by a genuine appreciation for the knowledge and skills that existed throughout the base. "Diana," Morrison said during one of their regular meetings, "I've been thinking about what happened that night, and I realize how close we came to disaster. Not just from the hostile aircraft, but from our own failure to recognize the expertise that was right in front of us." Lieutenant Chun, now Captain Chun, had become one of Diana's strongest advocates and had established a mentorship program that paired experienced pilots with ground crew personnel to improve communication and understanding between specialties. Diana showed us that some of the most important knowledge comes from people who watch and listen rather than those who give orders. Chun explained to new pilots during orientation briefings the story of Diana Kellerman's transformation from dismissed cleaning lady to respected aviation expert had spread far beyond Crimson Valley Air Force Base. Military publications had featured articles about her unique approach to safety monitoring, and civilian aviation organizations had invited her to speak at conferences about the importance of recognizing expertise in unexpected places. But Diana's greatest satisfaction came not from the recognition or the professional advancement, but from the letters she received from pilots throughout the Air Force who had been helped by the safety programs she had developed. Young aviators wrote to thank her for creating an environment where their concerns were taken seriously. Experienced pilots expressed gratitude for systems that had identified potential problems before they became emergencies. One letter particularly moved her, from a pilot stationed at an F-35 base in Florida. "Ms. Kellerman, because of the safety observation program you developed, our maintenance team identified a subtle engine problem that could have caused a catastrophic failure during combat operations. Your work saved my life, and I wanted you to know that your expertise is protecting pilots you'll never meet at bases you'll never visit." Diana kept that letter on her desk as a reminder of why her work mattered. She had learned that expertise without recognition was frustrating, but expertise with the opportunity to make a difference was profoundly fulfilling. The civilian world had also taken notice of Diana's story. News organizations had featured her transformation as an example of how prejudice and rigid thinking could blind organizations to the talents of their own people. Business schools used her case study to teach future leaders about the importance of listening to all employees, regardless of their position in the organizational hierarchy. Young women, particularly those interested in aviation careers, had found inspiration in Diana's journey from invisible cleaning lady to respected expert. She received emails from college students pursuing aerospace engineering degrees, from women learning to fly, and from military personnel who had been discouraged by setbacks in their own careers. Diana had established a scholarship fund for women pursuing aviation careers using the speaking fees she earned from conference presentations and the consulting income from her work with civilian aerospace companies. She wanted to ensure that future generations of women would not face the barriers that had once forced her into exile from the profession she loved. On quiet evenings, Diana would sometimes walk through the hangars where she had once pushed a cleaning cart, observing the F-22 Raptors that had become so familiar to her over the years. The aircraft themselves hadn't changed, but everything else was different. She was no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, no longer forced to hide her expertise behind a facade of ignorant compliance. As she watched young airmen and pilots going about their duties, Diana reflected on the universal lesson that her story represented. Talent, expertise, and dedication existed in every organization, often in places where leadership never thought to look. The cleaning staff, the security guards, the cafeteria workers, the administrative assistants, all of these people observed the organization from unique perspectives that could provide valuable insights if anyone bothered to ask for their opinions. Diana had proven that heroism didn't always wear wings or carry credentials. Sometimes it wore coveralls and carried a mop. Sometimes it arrived quietly, speaking softly, offering help without demanding recognition. Sometimes the most important person in the room was the one everyone ignored, until the moment when their knowledge became the difference between success and catastrophe. Her story had become a reminder that in a world obsessed with titles, degrees, and official positions, the most valuable expertise often belonged to those who watched carefully, learned continuously, and stood ready to serve when others could not. Diana Kellerman had taught an entire Air Force base that competence and character couldn't be measured by rank or position, but only by the willingness to act with courage and skill when it mattered most. Because sometimes the greatest wings weren't made of metal or awarded by institutions. Sometimes they were forged from experience, shaped by adversity, and earned through the quiet dedication of those who chose to serve regardless of recognition. And sometimes when the lights went out and the experts failed, those invisible wings were exactly what the world needed to soar. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.